Oh, this is humiliating, beautiful community. So let's humiliate ourselves and watch some Alexander Dugin, because he went on the podcast of Ksenia Sobchak, who is Vladimir Putin's goddaughter. Now, and I'm not equating her politics with Putin's when I say that, but what's most striking in this whole conversation, which few of you asked me to watch, and I just didn't, because I just watched the first 15 minutes. That's what we're going to analyze. And I also caught another bit, and that is the bit that is most interesting, but we won't talk about it because I think I want to talk about it another time, because it's actually quite interesting. And that's when Dugin is asked, what's your relationship with Putin like? Have you spoken to him? Have you met him? And he says, pass. But then he says, I can say that he definitely needs a court philosopher. But I won't comment on what my contact with him is, and you probably have more contact with him than me, and Sobchak doesn't have much contact with Putin. So that's very important from the point of view of this Western narrative that Dugin is Putin's brain, but that's not what we'll talk about. We'll talk about Dugin apparently discussing North Korea in the first few minutes of the interview. So let's fasten ourselves in. Is there a generic usefulness to this? Yes. When some Western countries lose their democracies in the 21st century, they are going to have authoritarian governments with various entrepreneurially posturing court philosophers. So it's a phenomenon worth being aware of in advance. Dugin is most remarkable, actually, for his unbelievable fusion of entrepreneurialism, and he is a good entrepreneur. Like, he's not those lamentable people who follow MAGA and try to sort of build their podcast around Trump. He is a very good entrepreneur. He's very good at manipulating the information environment. But that's also fused for him with something else, which is this unbelievable postmodernist relativism, whereby very largely he goes on thinking that the things to say about important parts of the world are the things that it pays to say. So let's see what he says about North Korea, beautiful community. I'll try to translate. So let me press screen record and then play. You are a world-famous ideologist of the Russian world, and you advance a conception of Russia as a separate civilization. There's actually a YouTube channel in Russian, I think, called Separate Civilization, that sort of mocks Russia's daily life. You represent Russia as a separate civilization. I want to see today an image of the beautiful Russia of the future. I want to see that through the eyes of Alexander Dugin. But I'm going to start with a quote, not from about Mother Russia, but your quote about North Korea. So here's your quote. North Korea is a bastion of humanism, democracy, and civilization in the face of US occupation. What is North Korea? It's freedom. It's an island of freedom. Can you explain why a totalitarian state is being called by you a bastion of humanism, democracy, and freedom? Let's begin with the fact that it's the only state that came to our aid when we found ourselves in a very difficult situation in this monstrous war. He who is your friend, who spills blood for you, who supports you, by definition, cannot be bad. From the one, that's on the one hand. So you can see the extraordinary relativization there, right? Because actually a mature adult asked on the doorstep won't think that you can just derive whether somebody is a good person or not from the fact that they've helped you. They'll be able to see these two questions as independent. And what Dugin is saying is we've got to engage in this act of creation, and this act of the creation of coalitions, this act of the creation of ideological spheres. So we've got to be active here. We've got to bring new things into existence, which is, of course, an elementary misunderstanding of the relationship of thought and practice. It doesn't work manually like that. Thought, in a way that we can't entirely control, impacts practice, having been itself impacted by practice. These causal arrows are complex, and they can't be under the whims of intentional human action. Up to a point, these things just go as they go. You can create certain conditions, you can create certain social conditions, right, for the creation of ideas that then have a certain kind of bite and resonance. But you can't just say, I've got an idea, and just try to jump higher and higher and higher and higher with it, and think that the higher you jump with it, the more this idea will develop an organic life of its own. It doesn't work like that. Even if you thought, although that thought would be useless for Dugin because he's a relativist about truth, but even if he wasn't, what you'd need is some kind of bizarre reality whereby truth sort of has a social power of its own. For Dugin, it wouldn't be truth, it would be a significant thing to say. But truth, or a significant thing to say, does not, as it were, pay its way in the world at the level of social power. So this is on the other hand. But this overtly closed society, if you compare it to Western democracies from the point of view of values, order, point of view of the compliance with various kinds of rules of life, if we distract ourselves from propaganda, then we see that many aspects of life in the just and egalitarian conditions of North Korea win over the Epstein civilization that is current in the West. And that's not everything. Here philosophy begins. Oh my God, he's such a dickhead. Oh my God. So if we take seriously the conception of Juche, which is the official worldview of North Korea, the doctrine of North Korea, which they inculcate from kindergarten, then we, with a degree of surprise, will discover in it, on top of a few elements of classical socialism, lots of distinctively inner, deep Korean traditional views. Juche means to be in the center of the world, to build the world starting from oneself, to be present in faith so intensively, so openly, so worthily, to be so independent of all external factors, to radiate rays of sunshine out of oneself, as everybody does in North Korea. What a muppet, unbelievable muppet. That's what it means to be Juche. But Ksenia says, but this has got nothing to do, as far as I can see, with humanism, democracy and freedom. It's not about humanism in the Western sense. And we know what all of that is worth, not much. It's not about Western democracy, and we know that's not worth much. And it's not about freedom in the sense of liberalism. But if we turn our attention to what freedom is, this is getting dangerous, beautiful community. This is my professional speciality. A theorist of liberalism, John Stuart Mill, he said that one freedom is purely negative, and that is the freedom of the liberals. It's freedom from. It's freedom from others telling you what to do and telling you how to use your freedom. It's a purely negative kind of freedom. And then there's freedom too. Constructive freedom, creative freedom, artistic freedom. And it has a big purpose about it. And this big freedom too is being rejected by liberals. But in the theory of Juche, this conception of freedom too, freedom for the people, freedom for the spirit, freedom for society, freedom for justice, freedom for creation. Freedom too in all of these spaces is being affirmed. Oh, this is so humiliating. Oh. The clearest distinction between freedom to and freedom from, probably in the history of the West, is made by Isaiah Berlin in his 1950s inaugural lecture to the Titchley Professorship of Social and Political Theory called Two Concepts of Liberty. And that doesn't even play a central part in Berlin's story there. All it is something, one of the things for which the piece is famous, and to a degree rightly, but to a degree wrongly. Insofar as it means anything for Berlin, it means two boxes. One box says, and I won't explain what that means, so just assume I'm literally saying blah, 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 but I'll be brief. One box means, and that's what Berlin thinks of as negative liberty, it means a construction of what the value of liberty in the modern world is. We did the construction of a value yesterday, the value of genocide, the concept of genocide. Rather, but the construction of the political value of liberty for Berlin is something that he's very, very keen to do in a minimally normatively and evaluatively rich manner. He wants to have as flat a conception of liberty as you can get away with, which means it shouldn't be too flat, but it's got to be as flat as is reasonable. And that, he thinks, is just a good way to construct freedom in the modern world. But even there are question marks about how far Berlin might not change the emphasis of his perspective under different circumstances. Later on in his life, he came to, for contingent reasons, be more concerned about a very minimal construction of freedom and more open to a degree to more involved and rich constructions. And I'm not going to tell you anything about why, but just forget about that. So I've just said blah, 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 but why have I just said blah, blah, blah? I've said blah, blah, blah because Dugin is attributing to a Western thinker something that doesn't really hold. The thinker to whom it is most commonly attributed is a different thinker to the one Dugin mentions, and even to him it doesn't really apply. The most famous exponent of this distinction wouldn't even be using the distinction in remotely the way Dugin wants it to be used. Dugin wants it to be used in terms of the distinction between something like authentic self-realization and freedom from interference. That's what the Berlin piece is famous for among people who haven't understood it properly, but it's actually not saying that. So who is saying that? Well, you could make some links between what Dugin is trying to say and Constant's early 1800s piece, The Liberty of the Ancients versus the Liberty of the Moderns. You could talk about the special elaboration of these richer, more self-realization-driven conceptions of liberty in the late 19th century with people like T.H. Green. You could even point to Arendt, who gets there via, quite frankly, a porridge of Hegel and Heidegger. But where would Mill fit into this? Like, what would Alan Ryan think, who is the leading expert on Mill in the world? If he saw that, he wouldn't know what Dugin is talking about. Mill comes from a tradition that puts a premium on non-interference, on freedom as non-interference. But Mill is a deeply perfectionist thinker and elaborates and pushes and breaks the bounds of that inheritance by introducing to this vast history of talk about external constraints, the business of internal constraints. Interference by other agents is one thing that can make you less free, but another could be you. And Mill stops short, but in a few moments, actually not very far short, of Marxian ideas of alienation and false consciousness. And he stops short because he's essentially concerned about authentic self-direction. And one of the ways he's most deeply concerned about authentic self-direction actually has huge resonance for you. And namely that he thinks that it's not centrally the state at his time in the middle 19th century in England. Well, it's not only the state that's a threat to individuals' freedom, but it's the propensity people have to lose themselves in the opinions of others, to the point that you no longer know what is something that you thought or what is something that's been thought for you. It's actually in chapter 3 of On Liberty is a very important statement on our predicament of algorithmic dependence in our world, right? So we can begin making a historical map, but like Dugin has begun to do that, crashed into a wall and drowned in a puddle. So you could say that that distinction that Dugin makes is barely coherent anyway. Insofar as it is coherent, you can map it on some writings, but not others. What you would say with Mill, if you want to push that distinction at all, is that Mill comes from a tradition linked to one side of this dichotomy. If it's a coherent dichotomy at all, then it isn't very freedom from. But then he breaks out of it and elaborates it in various ways. But is not somebody who offers a distinction between two types of freedom, one of which is freedom to and one of them is freedom from. I asked Google just before I turned on the smartphone, whether Mill makes a distinction like that, and Google AI said, yes, he does. And then I said, don't bullshit me. And Google said, oh, sorry, he doesn't. And the reason this is interesting for us is that this is the level at which most intellectualized conversation in our culture occurs. So the intellectualized content you follow, right, has this level roughly of faithfulness relative to the objects in the history of Western civilization that it discusses. And if you lose that perspective, if you lose a sense of who you are, where you've come from and where you're going, you basically can't think clearly about what to do. And you can't think clearly about how far you are constrained or able to do different things that make a difference. So, like, take a philosophy class, Mr. Dugin. I reckon actually he'd just concede the point. If you pressed him, he wouldn't faff around. He'd just say, yeah, sorry. But it's still interesting because, if you're claiming to be a philosopher, like, have some respect for the objects you interact with.
Точно так же и гуманизм. Понимание человека может быть экзистенциальным, как в доктрине Чучхе, а может быть отчужденным, как в современном западном индивидуализме. И обычно просто по умолчанию мы стоим на
So he is continuing.
и все оцениваем глазами Запада.
Yeah, he's just continuing to talk about how we see North Korea from a Western point of view. And if you really thought about it properly, you'd say the people of North Korea were free. Last remark then. Does Dugin think that the people of North Korea are freer than the people of Denmark? And is he unsure, or does he have a clear view about it? He has a clear view. His view is that basically the people of North Korea are not freer. However, he has a double-mindedness about this. And the second part of this double-mindedness is that thinking it makes it so. What is it helpful for an aspiring Russian court philosopher to say about North Korea is the question he's asking himself, not the question of what's actually happening to the people of North Korea. Because if you approach it by other means and you put him in a position where he doesn't have to say anything explicit about how bad North Korea is, you can actually get him to concede nearly everything about the awfulness of life in North Korea. So this is an absolutely exquisite blend of entrepreneurialism and relativism. Lots of love, beautiful community.